In the wide, wind-stripped plains of West Texas, a 42-year-old rancher named Calvin Hargrove vanished from his remote property in 2005 without leaving so much as a boot print behind. Authorities insisted he'd simply walked off, maybe debts, maybe stress, but there was no note, no struggle, and no trace of a man who knew every inch of that land. For 4 silent years the case gathered dust, until an oil crew drilling a new line outside his property shattered metal deep underground. At first they thought it was equipment failure, but what they pulled from that borehole would rewrite the final hours of Calvin's life. The wind moved strangely that morning, soft, unsure, as if it sensed something was about to go missing. Out on the edge of the West Texas plains, the Hargrove Ranch sat quiet beneath a pale dawn sky. This was the kind of land that told the truth through sound: rattling gates, distant coyotes, the cry of a hawk sweeping low. And yet, on the day Calvin Hargrove vanished, the land said nothing at all. Calvin had lived alone on that ranch for nearly 2 decades. And in all that time the routine had never changed. He woke before sunrise, fed the cattle, checked the south fence line, and drove into town twice a week for feed and mail. People joked that if someone wanted to find him, all they needed to do was follow the dust trail of his pickup. Predictability was his religion, which was why the days leading up to his disappearance stuck out like a burr under a saddle. 2 nights before he vanished, his neighbor, Walt Ramsey, remembered hearing something heavy metal on metal echoing across the pasture. Sounded like a truck bed slamming shut, Walt recalled later. But it weren't Calvin's. His engine always coughed first before it turned over. Calvin had mentioned it too. He stopped Walt at the fence line the next morning, eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat. "You been hearing things out here late?" Calvin asked. Walt shrugged. "Coyotes, maybe." "No," Calvin said softly. This was different. He never elaborated. 3 days before disappearing, Calvin visited his sister Mary in town. She asked how he was holding up. Rumors of financial strain had made their way to her, and she knew he'd been arguing with an out-of-state contractor who wanted access to part of his land for surveying. Calvin brushed it off at first, but eventually sighed. "People don't respect boundaries anymore," he muttered. "They think empty land means no one's watching." Mary asked what that meant, but he changed the subject. When he hugged her goodbye, he held on a beat longer than usual. By the morning he vanished, small things were already out of place. His porch light, which he turned off religiously at dawn, still glowed faintly against the dim sky. His coffee pot, usually empty by 6 a.m., was half full and still warm, and one of his boots, normally kept by the door, lay tipped on its side as if knocked over. Walt noticed something too. Calvin's cattle hadn't been released for morning graze. That alone was enough to make him climb into his truck and drive over. When he arrived, everything felt wrong. Not chaotic, not violent, just paused. He called out Calvin's name across the yard. Nothing. He checked the barn, the workshop, the feed shed. All of them stood open, undisturbed, as if Calvin had stepped away for a moment and simply never stepped back. The only movement came from a loose strand of wire on the south fence line, swaying gently even though the wind had died. When deputies arrived, they asked Walt when he'd last seen Calvin. "Yesterday," Walt said. He waved at me from his truck, same as always. But now, staring out at the empty pasture, Walt frowned. "Thing is," he looked tired, real tired. That detail lingered with investigators, but nothing else made sense. Calvin wasn't impulsive. He wasn't depressed. He wasn't the kind of man who would leave without a trace. And if he'd wanted to start over somewhere, he wouldn't have left behind his truck, his dogs, and his entire livelihood. The last sign of him came from a single, quiet moment that no one witnessed. The sun rising over his south pasture, the same place he'd reported hearing noises days earlier. Something had drawn him out there. Something had met him before the morning light could. And as the deputies began a wider search, one of them noticed the first truly unsettling clue. Calvin's hat perched on a fence post, placed carefully, almost respectfully, facing the open field like it was waiting for him to return. But Calvin Hargrove never returned, and the land, for once, refused to say what it had seen. The first deputy on scene, Raymond Cortez, stepped out of his vehicle and immediately felt the strangeness in the air, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Ranch disappearances usually left a trail, footprints, hoof marks, tire tracks, something. But everywhere he looked, the dirt lay smooth, undisturbed, all the way out to the horizon. It was the kind of clean, wind-polished surface that should have taken days to form. Yet last night had been perfectly still. Deputy Cortez walked the perimeter of the house, then the barn, then the south gate. Nothing. No scuffle, no drag marks, no sign of Calvin wandering off in confusion or being forced anywhere against his will. It was as though the man had been plucked off the earth. Inside the small ranch home, Mary Calvin's sister stood stiff and pale, gripping her brother's worn leather jacket in both hands. "Please tell me you found tracks," she said, voice tight. Cortez shook his head. "Not yet. We're widening the search." "But Calvin doesn't just disappear," she insisted, her voice rising. "He's not the type." The deputies knew that. Many of them had grown up around Calvin, bought cattle from him, borrowed his tools, shared beers with him after long days at the stockyard. The idea of him wandering away willingly didn't fit. By noon, a full search grid swept the ranch. Horses, ATVs, and volunteers fanned across the land. Still nothing. Until they reached the south pasture. It was Deputy Rhodes who noticed the first anomaly, a set of long, shallow depressions in the soil, running parallel to one another like the faint imprint of something heavy being dragged. But even that explanation didn't quite fit. The lines didn't snake or wobble the way drag marks usually did. They were steady, perfectly straight, almost as though something with weight but no shape had pressed downward from above. "Could be old irrigation equipment," Rhodes suggested. Cortez frowned. "There's no record of irrigation lines here." Rhodes crouched, running a finger along the compacted soil. "Whatever it was, it's big." Calvin's hat still sat on the fence post nearby, its brim stiff from years of sun, its placement deliberate. The wind hadn't knocked it there. Someone's hand had. The deputies radioed back to command, and soon the pasture filled with investigators. But as they scanned the ground, they found nothing else, no tire tread, no boot prints, nothing that connected Calvin to the strange depressions. Sheriff Montoya arrived late afternoon, taking a slow walk across the property before calling the team together. "So what are we thinking?" he asked. "Maybe he walked off," someone offered. "With no tracks?" another countered. "Maybe someone picked him up." "In what? A helicopter?" Montoya shot a look at the deputy who said that. But even he couldn't dismiss the thought entirely. The marks didn't match any trailer, tractor, or ranch tool they knew, and they were too deep to be made by hand. Mary approached the group, listening as they tossed around theories. "You're assuming Calvin walked away," she said sharply. "But how could he? He'd never leave his dogs, never leave his truck. And those marks," she pointed toward the pasture. "He didn't make those." "We're not ruling anything out," Montoya assured her. But his voice lacked conviction. Later that evening, after the search teams pulled back for the night, Deputy Cortez stood alone at the pasture's edge, staring at the faint, parallel lines stretching into the earth. The sunset cast long shadows over them, making the depressions appear deeper, more deliberate. He knelt, touched the soil again. Cool, compact, recently disturbed. But no tool shed on the ranch contained anything capable of making marks like that. In fact, nothing on Calvin's entire property explained the strange geometry carved into the ground. And, if something large had been dragged across the land, why had it left only those marks, and nothing else? The land, usually so honest, had given them a clue that felt more like a riddle. As Cortez stood, the breeze whispered across the grass, and for a moment he wondered whether the ranch was hiding something, or whether something had come onto the ranch that did not belong here. The chapter closed, just as the sun disappeared, with one unsettling certainty. Whatever had made those tracks, it had not left any sign of Calvin Hargrove following behind it. For months after the search was suspended, Calvin Hargrove's ranch sat untouched, as if the land itself refused to accept a new owner. Grass grew high around the fence posts. Dust gathered thick on the porch steps. The cattle were sold off. The windows stayed dark. Locals said it felt wrong driving past it at night, like the house was waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. Mary visited twice a week in the beginning. She'd park by the gate, unlock it slowly, and walk the same paths her brother once walked. Every time she stepped onto the property, she half expected to hear his boots on the gravel behind her. But there was never a sound. Only the rustle of dry grass brushing against her jeans. She kept his old Chevy pickup in her barn, refusing to let anyone touch it. The dust on the windshield grew thicker. The tires slowly flattened. But the keys stayed in the ignition, just as Calvin had always left them. "I'll know when it's time to move on," she'd tell her husband. But 4 years passed, and the truck stayed exactly where it was, like a placeholder for a truth she couldn't bear to face. Around town, the theories continued to mutate. In the diner, at the feed store, in the church hallway after Sunday service. Everyone had an idea of what might have happened to Calvin. "He wandered off and got lost," one rancher offered. Calvin's friend Bobby shook his head. "Calvin doesn't get lost. That man could navigate blindfolded. Maybe he just wanted a new life," someone else whispered. Mary stiffened. "He would have told me. He told me everything." But not everything. People murmured under their breath. Not about the noises in the south pasture, not about the arguments with surveyors, not about the strange unease he'd been carrying the week before he vanished. There was one man, however, an old friend named Enoch Grayson, who never once believed Calvin left by choice. Enoch had worked the land beside Calvin for years, repairing fence lines, hauling cattle, fixing busted gates during storm season. He wasn't scared of the world, Enoch told the sheriff once. But he was scared of something out there. I saw it in his face before he disappeared. When asked what Calvin had said, Enoch shook his head. "Nothing." That's how I knew it was serious. By 2009, the Hargrove Ranch had become a place people avoided. Teenagers dared each other to walk along the fence at night. Hunters swore they heard metal clanks echoing across the pasture after dark. Even seasoned ranchers refused to graze livestock too close to the south field. Eventually, the property was sold not to another rancher, but to a regional oil company surveying land for a new drilling corridor. The documents were signed quietly. Mary never visited the ranch again after that. She couldn't bear the thought of heavy machinery tearing into soil her brother had walked his entire life. But progress did not wait for grief. Within months, crews rolled in with drill rigs, derricks, seismic equipment, and supply trucks. The once still ranch hummed with diesel engines and clattering steel. Dust clouds rose high into the sky. Workers cut new access paths and cleared the overgrown pasture. To them, it was just another job site. To the land, it was a long-delayed disturbance of something that had been buried too peacefully for too long. On a cool morning in early autumn, as crews prepared to run the first deep test drill, a foreman paused and looked out over the south pasture, the same one where Calvin's hat had been found. Something about the stillness unsettled him. But work was work, and the drill had to turn. The silence of the past 4 years was about to break, and what waited underground had been waiting a very long time. The drill rig groaned awake just after sunrise, its steel frame shuddering as the bit lowered into the earth. Workers moved with practiced rhythm, checking gauges, tightening bolts, shouting instructions over the whine of machinery. To them, the south pasture was nothing more than another job site, another stretch of stubborn Texas dirt to punch through. But as the bit descended, slicing deeper and deeper, several of the crew felt an odd tension in the air, like a quiet warning. At 40 feet, the drill should have hit packed clay. Instead, the bit screeched a hard, metallic shriek that rattled through the rig like a struck bell. The whole frame jolted. Sparks flickered where no sparks should be. "Kill the motor," the foreman barked. The rig powered down in a violent rattle that left the crew staring at one another. Striking metal wasn't unheard of. Old fence lines, forgotten tools, but none of that existed 40 feet underground. Not on this property. Not according to any map, deed, or geological report. The foreman spat dust from his mouth. "We hit something. Get the scanner." A ground-penetrating radar unit was brought over, its antenna sweeping slowly across the soil. The screen flickered with static, then stabilized, revealing the unmistakable outline of something solid, something angled, and something far too large to be a stray pipe. "Looks like a cage," a technician murmured, narrowing his eyes. "A what?" the foreman snapped. "Or a crate?" "Hard to say. Whatever it is, it's not natural, and it sure as hell wasn't put there by hand." Unease rippled through the crew. A few men exchanged glances. Stories of the missing rancher had circulated on their first week at the site. They had laughed then. No one laughed now. The decision was made to widen the borehole and extract whatever the bit had struck. The machinery dug into the ground, hauling up clods of dirt that smelled cold and strangely metallic. As the cavity opened, something glimmered faintly in the shadows, a rust-flecked corner of metal crushed inward as though under immense weight. "Jesus," someone whispered. "How long's that been down there?" The foreman crouched beside the pit, brushing away soil with gloved hands. The metal was warped, pushed in at unnatural angles. Not crushed by time or natural erosion. Crushed by force. Before anyone could speculate further, a shout came from 10 yards away. "Hey, over here." A worker stood frozen beside a patch of earth recently churned by the widening excavation. At his feet, half buried in compacted soil, was a leather boot, its stitching weathered, its heel collapsed. Dust clung to the edges, but the shape was unmistakable. A man's work boot. Old, but not ancient. Preserved by the earth around it. The foreman's jaw tightened. "Don't touch it." But one look was enough. Everyone knew whose boot it might be. Calvin Hargrove had worn that style, that brand, that size. Silence fell, heavy and suffocating, as realization spread through the crew. The stories they'd dismissed as local superstition now took on a grim edge. Within an hour, sheriff's vehicles tore up the access road, stirring clouds of dust behind them. Sheriff Montoya stepped out, stared at the boot, then at the exposed metal below. "You sure there's no record of this?" he asked the foreman. "None. This ain't part of any ranch infrastructure." Montoya exhaled sharply. Then what the hell was it doing 40 feet down? An investigator from the sheriff's office climbed down into the pit with a flashlight, running the beam along the metal surface. The light revealed crushed bars, bent outward in some places, inward in others, like something or someone had struggled inside. "This wasn't buried," the investigator murmured, tracing the warped steel with a shaking hand. "It was forced down." Montoya's head snapped toward him. "Forced? With what?" The man shook his head. Something heavy and deliberate. As they worked, more metal was uncovered, angled panels, twisted supports, remnants of locking mechanisms smashed beyond recognition. Piece by piece, the shape of the structure emerged, but its purpose remained shrouded in dread. By sundown, deputies had cordoned off the entire pasture. The foreman dismissed his crew for the evening, though most lingered in uneasy clusters, staring at the pit from a distance. Nobody said it out loud. Nobody had to. Whatever had happened to Calvin Hargrove hadn't taken place on the surface. It had happened beneath it. And now, after 4 silent years, the earth had finally given up part of its secret. Floodlights bathed the south pasture in a harsh white glow as investigators worked through the night, excavating the object inch by inch. The once flat ground now yawned open like a wound, exposing twisted metal ribs and compacted layers of soil that had settled around it for years. Every shovelful carried the weight of a secret the earth had tried to keep buried. The structure finally emerged enough to reveal its unmistakable form. A livestock transport cage, the kind used to move cattle or large livestock. But this one was unlike any cage a rancher would use. Its bars were thicker, reinforced, modified with welded plates along the inside. It had been built to contain something or someone without any chance of escape. And it had been crushed inward, as though a massive pressure had been applied after something was placed inside. Sheriff Montoya stood with arms folded, staring at the warped steel. "No one registers equipment like this in the county," he muttered. Deputy Cortez glanced up. Who would even need a reinforced cage? Montoya didn't answer, but his silence spoke volumes. An evidence tech swept her flashlight across the interior and froze. "Sheriff, you need to see this." Pinned between two bent bars, protected from years of decay by a layer of compacted soil, was a torn scrap of denim. The stitching pattern was old-fashioned, distinctive. Mary would later identify it instantly: Calvin's work jacket. A hush settled over the pit. Cortez swallowed hard. So, he was in there. Montoya nodded grimly. Looks that way. But a deeper question simmered beneath his words. Who put him there? As they removed more soil, the full shape of the cage came into view. It was rectangular, nearly 8 feet long, designed with a rear loading gate. But the gate had been locked shut, then smashed inward, as though something large had rammed against it over and over. Scratch marks lined the interior steel. Long, frantic grooves dug into the metal by fingertips or tools nobody could yet tell. Cortez's voice was barely audible. He was alive when they put him in. The wind swept across the pasture then, carrying a low, mournful whistle through the exposed frame. Several investigators stepped back, shaken by the realization, but another detail soon shifted the mood from grief to dread. A geologist on loan from the oil company crouched beside the pit, sifting soil samples and comparing layers, his brow furrowed deeper with every handful. "Sheriff, you need to see this," he said. Montoya joined him. "What is it now?" "The soil strata around the cage. These layers, this compaction, it didn't happen naturally." "How long has it been down there?" The geologist inhaled slowly. "Based on density, temperature retention, and mineral settling, this cage was buried about 4 years ago. Almost exactly." Montoya stiffened. "The night he vanished?" "Yes, sir." A collective breath caught in the cool night air. The cage had not been a relic of the past buried by land shifts or storms. It had been deliberately sunk the very night Calvin disappeared, using machinery far more powerful than anything he owned. Heavy equipment capable of forcing a steel cage downward into the earth, as though pressing a thumb into wet clay. But why bury it straight down, instead of dragging it somewhere else? Why hide it on the same property? And who would risk returning to the ranch long enough to cover their tracks literally and figuratively? Evidence pointed to one chilling truth. Whoever buried Calvin had known the land well enough to choose a location no one would disturb for years. Deputy Rhodes found another clue: faint imprints in the deeper clay beneath the cage, parallel and evenly spaced. He knelt, running his hand along the grooves. "Tracks," he murmured. "Machinery. Something with stabilizers, like a drilling rig or a heavy hydraulic press." Cortez frowned. "But there was no construction here in 2005. "Not officially," Rhodes said. Theories that once felt far-fetched suddenly sharpened into possibilities. Trespassers Calvin had confronted. Survey crews he'd argued with. Unknown vehicles seen near his property the week he vanished. People with access to industrial machinery. Mary arrived at dawn, wrapped in her brother's old jacket. She looked down into the pit, eyes wide, breath trembling. Is he down there?" Montoya shook his head gently. "We haven't found remains yet. But we found evidence he was inside." Tears welled in her eyes. "He didn't go willingly." "No," Montoya said, "he didn't." The sun crested the horizon then, casting long shadows across the exposed steel shadows that looked eerily like prison bars stretching across the earth. The truth was rising, inch by inch, with every shovel of dirt removed. And yet, the most terrifying discovery still waited beneath the warped floor of the cage, a detail investigators had only just begun to uncover. A detail that would redefine Calvin's final hours. Morning light spilled across the south pasture as investigators uncovered the final section of the buried cage. Exhaustion weighed on every shoulder, but no one stepped away. What they were revealing wasn't just evidence, it was the last known chapter of a man's life, preserved in layers of soil and silence. Deputy Cortez crouched near the exposed floor of the cage, brushing away the final packed layer of earth. Something metallic gleamed beneath the dust. "Sheriff, you'd better see this." Montoya knelt beside him, as Cortez lifted a bent steel pin, part of the cage's locking mechanism. But the break wasn't from rust or age, it had snapped clean under force. "He tried to get out," Cortez whispered. Scratch marks confirmed it. They weren't random. They formed arcs, patterns, the desperate movements of someone using every ounce of strength to pry, bend, or claw his way free. The marks grew more chaotic near the crushed rear gate, as if Calvin had thrown himself against it repeatedly. "God help him," Montoya muttered. But the chilling detail wasn't the scratches. It was the angle of the cage. The geologist returned with his tablet, pulling up a 3D model of the scan. "The cage wasn't placed flat," he explained, voice tight. "It was tilted slightly forward when buried. That kind of angle, it happens when weight is applied at the top, pressing down in one direction." "Weight from what?" Montoya asked. "A heavy rig, industrial. Probably hydraulic." "Like an oil drill?" "Yes, or something nearly identical." The implications hit them like a punch. Someone had used machinery, the kind not owned by ranchers, to force the cage straight into the earth, crushing it as it sank. The soil around it had been compacted deliberately, leaving no trace on the surface. Calvin hadn't simply been buried. He had been pressed into the ground, entombed alive in a steel cage. But why leave it here? Why take such enormous risk to conceal it on the same property? Montoya stepped back, staring across the wind-swept field. A memory drifted forward, a report filed quietly months before Calvin vanished. An out-of-state contracting company had been surveying land in the area for potential drilling corridors. Several ranchers, including Calvin, had filed complaints of unauthorized vehicles crossing fences at night. Calvin had even argued with representatives from that company days before his disappearance. No proof of wrongdoing, no charges, just tension and trespassing that never got resolved. Montoya's jaw tightened. "He confronted someone," he muttered. "Someone with access to heavy equipment." Cortez added, "Someone who didn't want him talking to the sheriff." As they pieced the timeline together, a chilling sequence formed. Calvin hears machinery near his south pasture. Calvin confronts unknown trespassers. He's overpowered, locked inside the modified livestock cage. A heavy rig, likely brought in under cover of darkness, crushes the cage downward into the earth. The ground is leveled carefully to erase all trace. Every theory pointed toward a human culprit, someone willing to destroy a man rather than be discovered. But motives remained murky. Illegal drilling, land disputes, hidden operations, none of it could yet be proven. When Mary returned in the late afternoon, the investigators paused their work. She stepped to the edge of the pit, hands trembling at the sight of the steel tomb. "This is how he spent his last hours?" she whispered. Montoya's eyes softened. "We believe he fought. Hard. That's what these marks mean." Mary nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. "That sounds like him." The prairie wind shifted, sweeping across the exposed metal frame, making it moan softly, almost like a voice trying to rise from below. As the sun dipped low, casting a long shadow across the pit, Montoya closed his notebook. "We've uncovered how he died," he said quietly, "but who did it and why is still buried deeper than this cage ever was." The ground held its silence, as it always had. But now the investigators knew. The truth had been down there all along, sealed beneath 40 feet of compacted earth and 4 years of unanswered questions. And somewhere out there, the people responsible were still walking free.